So hey everybody, now that we're in phase three, and there are officially no final exams, and we aren't watching Forrest Gump, which is normally what we would do towards the end, so I'm pretty bummed about that. We're going to kind of move on to the next kind of like, timeline of history is over. We're going to do some more modern stuff, right? But we're going to take it easy, because we would be doing, like I said, Forrest Gump. I'd kill a week on that one. We'd have an assessment over it, believe it or not, a little Gump trivia. So we're gonna take it fairly easy, all right? So what we're gonna do is we're gonna be reading essentially a book by Andrew Bacevich, who is a professor at Boston College, called "The Limits of Power." Now, here's the deal. Andrew Bacevich, for you guys that might go into international relations, which is like maybe 1% of you, he's actually a pretty big deal. And you'll probably read a lot of his stuff. This is some of his early stuff. One thing I want to make sure everybody understands is you don't have to agree with everything he says here. I want to make sure that you guys are understanding that. I don't agree with everything he says, but he makes some important points. He's a very big figure in this kind of intellectual world of international relations and history and stuff like that right now. And it's important that you understand his arguments, because we're going to be getting into a lot of like the war on terror and how we handle that, and the Iraq War, the Afghanistan War, the wars that we were in since you were born, and why we got into those. Now, with that being said, he also has some pretty serious bias. He is former military. He was a colonel in the military as his highest rank. And keep in mind that he had a son who would have been roughly my age now, who died in the Iraq War. And so he obviously has some pretty strong opinions about that and the war on terror in general. So what we're going to do to kind of kick this bad boy off is we're going to read the introduction, all right? And I'm probably going to do this in 2 videos just to make downloading it easier. But we're going to do the introduction, all right? And as I read, I'm going to tell you to highlight certain spots. I'll say, like we've done in the past, highlight this, stop there. Highlight this, you highlight. Stop there, you stop highlighting. All right, hopefully I won't make you color the whole page like I've done in the past. There's no one here to tell me to stop, but or to ask if we'd stopped. But I also mainly want to do this one, like we're not going to do this for every segment of the book. We're probably not going to even read the whole book, but we're not going to do it for every segment of the book. I mainly want to do this intro so that you get some basic ideas and concepts of what he's dealing with, and more importantly, some of his terminology, because this is something that you would probably not read in high school. It's something you probably would read at the college level. And so there's some stuff I just want to make sure you understand. And of course, I got to make some commentary, because I can't not make my commentary. So with that said, Andrew Bacevich, The Limits of Power, Introduction. War without exits. What does that mean? We're about to find out. Strap in. All right. For the United States, the passing of the Cold War yielded neither a peace dividend nor anything remotely resembling peace. Instead, what was hailed as a historic victory gave way almost immediately to renewed unrest and conflict. By the time the East-West standoff that some historians had termed the Long Peace ended in 1991, the United States had already embarked upon a decade of unprecedented interventionism. In the years that followed, Americans became inured to reports of the U.S. forces going into action, fighting in Panama, the Persian Gulf, occupying Bosnia and Haiti, land-based in Kosovo, Afghanistan, and Sudan from the air. Yet all of these turned out to be mere preliminaries. In 2001 came the main event, an open-ended global war on terror, soon known in some quarters as the Long War. All right? And so when he's referencing the Cold War, it is, some people will call it the Long Peace. I have a feeling that anyone that was in Vietnam or Afghanistan with the Soviet Union or in Korea would not say it was very peaceful. But it's the idea, again, that the Cold War is the United States and the Soviet Union not actually going into war, exchanging gunfire with each other, because as we all know, that would lead to nuclear holocaust and really, really bad day for everybody, because nobody wins a nuclear war. All right, so a lot of times it's referred to as the Long Peace because it's this Cold War, but we don't fight with each other kind of thing. All right, now he then refers to this concept that, like, well, theoretically, the Soviet Union crumbles, so we won the Cold War, and therefore we should be now into a long peace. All right, come say hi quick. Hurry.
Hi.
Augustus wants to say hi. Yeah, get your stuff on and you can go.
Hi.
Okay.
Bye.
All right. And so here's the deal. All right. Now the idea is that once we have, quote unquote, won the Cold War, we are now in this time frame of all of a sudden massive intervention, right? We send troops to around the globe, all right, in order to, quote unquote, protect our interests, those being different interests depending upon the region that we are occupying with our military. And so what does that all mean? Viewed in retrospect, indications of the long peace began almost immediately to give way to conditions antithetical to peace seem blindingly obvious. Prior to 9/11, however, the implications of developments like the 1993 bombing of the World Trade Center or the failure of the U.S. military mission to Somalia that same year were difficult to discern. Highlight this. After all, these small events were left unaltered, what many took to be the defining reality of the contemporary era, the preeminence of the United States, which seemed beyond challenge. Stop there. And so you have this idea that the United States, right, is the strongest nation in the universe at this point, right? I mean, we won the Cold War. There were two world powers at the end of the Cold War. There was us, and there was the Soviet Union, and we won. And therefore, we must be the most powerful. We must be the most influential. We must be the greatest nation to right now, superpower-wise, ever, right? However, if you look, there are some chinks in our armor there, right? You have Somalia, which if nobody knows, if you've ever seen the movie Black Hawk Down, that's the one where we try to capture some warlords that are taking UN medical supplies illegally, and we get in a massive kind of rescue mission. I'm sorry. Well, no, I shouldn't say rescue mission. We get in a massive combat situation trying to capture that warlord, and it goes horribly awry. And had we been fighting a professional military anywhere else in the world, we would have lost terribly. Great movie, by the way, Black Hawk Down. I believe it's on Netflix. You should watch it. And then we also have the World Trade Center bombing in 1993. Now, if you don't know what that is, that's the attack prior to 9/11 that you all know. And in 1993, Al-Qaeda essentially rented a truck and put a giant fertilizer bomb in it, drove it down in the parking area of the World Trade Center, and they blew it up, and it worked. It blew up. But it didn't work, because what they did is they actually didn't get very good blueprints, and they put it in the most strategically sound, like structurally sound, I should say, not strategically, structurally sound section of the entire building. And therefore, it didn't do anything. But the bigger issue is this. We didn't do anything in response, right? And so maybe, what does it mean? And this begins to bring in the question. We get embarrassed in Somalia. There's a massive terrorist attack on home soil. With the Cold War over, what does it mean to be a superpower now? That's the big issue, right? Okay. During the 1990s, at the urging of politicians and pundits, Americans became accustomed to thinking of their country as the indispensable nation. Indispensability carried with it both responsibilities and prerogatives. The chief responsibility was to preside over a grand project of political economic convergence and integration commonly referred to as globalization. In point of fact, however, globalization served as a euphemism for soft or informal empire. Highlight this. The collapse of the Soviet Union prepared to offer an opportunity to expand and perpetuate that empire, creating something akin to a global Pax Americana. All right, stop there. So now, what that means is, by the way, we're supposed to highlight from the collapse of the Soviet Union to Pax Americana. Stop there. And so what that essentially means, everybody, is maybe we were trying to kind of push our will upon what he's theorizing is that with this idea that we were preeminent, this idea that we were the power, right? We tried to now impose our democracy upon the world, right? And we've done this before, with the Spanish-American War and our empire building after that, the imperialism after that. And maybe we're on imperialism round two, the idea that we won the Cold War, our ideology won, our economy won. It's got to be the best. Therefore, everyone else will definitely want that. And whether they like it or not, we're going to kind of assign it to them. All right? The indispensable nation's chief prerogative self-assigned, was to establish and influence the norms governing the post-Cold War international order. Even in the best of circumstances, imperial policing is a demanding task, requiring not only considerable acumen but also an abundance of determination. The preferred American approach was to rely whenever possible on suasion, yet if pressed, Washington did not hesitate to use force, as its numerous military adventures during the 1990s demonstrated. Highlight this. Whatever means were employed, the management of empire assumed the existence of bountiful reserves of power, economic, political, cultural, and above all, military. Stop there. In the immediate aftermath of the Cold War, few questioned that assumption. The status of the United States as sole superpower appeared unassailable. Its dominance was unquestioned and unambiguous. This was not hyper-nationalistic chest-thumping. It was the conventional wisdom. Recalling how Washington saw the post-Cold War world and America's place in or atop it, it helps us understand why policymakers failed to anticipate, deter, or deflect the terrorist attacks of September 11, 2001. Highlight this. A political elite preoccupied with the governance of empire paid little attention to protecting the United States itself. In practical terms, prior to 9/11, the mission of Homeland Defense was unassigned. The institution, nominally referred to as the Department of Defense, didn't actually do defense. It specialized in power projection. Stop there. And so what he means by that is, with this idea that we are the most powerful, with this idea that we are imposing our will upon the world in order to spread our democratic values, is that we really aren't worried about being attacked, like physically attacked at home, because who would, right? Like, that'd be insanity to attack this superpower of America, the global dominant nation of all nations. Who would dare attack us? And so we're going to have our defense really be our projection of power in regions where we think we have vested interest, right? And so that's what they mean by that. All right, I should say, Basevich means by that. In 2001, the Pentagon was prepared for any number of contingencies in the Balkans, which is in that where Greece is in Europe and the Balkan Peninsula, or Northwest Asia or the Persian Gulf. It was not prepared to address threats to the nation's eastern seaboard. He means like New York City, Hickory 9/11. Well-trained and equipped U.S. forces stood ready to defend Seoul, right, South Korea, or Riyadh, right, Manhattan was left to fend for itself. This idea, again, that we kind of left ourselves out there, because who would attack us? Who would dare attack us, okay? Odd as they may seem, these priorities reflected a core principle of national security policy. Highlight this. When it came to defending vital American interests, asserting control over the imperial periphery that took precedence over guarding the nation's own perimeter. Stop there. After 9/11, the Bush administration affirmed this core principle. Although it cobbled together a new agency to attend to Homeland Security, the administration also redoubled its efforts to shore up the Pax Americana and charged the Department of Defense with focusing on this task. This meant using any means necessary, suasion where possible, force as required, to bring the Islamic world into conformity with the prescribed American norm. Highlight this. Rather than soft and consensual, the approach to imperial governance became harder and more coercive. Stop there. So for the United States after 9/11, war became a seemingly permanent condition. President George W. Bush and members of his administration outlined a campaign against terror that they suggested might last decades, if not longer. On the national political scene, few questioned that prospect. In the Pentagon, senior military officers spoke in terms of generational war, lasting up to a century. Just 2 weeks after 9/11, Secretary of Defense Donald Rumsfeld was already instructing Americans to forget about exit strategies. We were looking at a sustained engagement that carried no deadlines. Highlight this. By and large, Americans were slow to grasp the implications of global war with no exits and no deadlines. Stop there. All right, so let's, really think about that. Generational war. And what does that mean? It means that a soldier, all right, has a family, and let's say he has a son who is in elementary school. He goes and fights. And he fights and he fights and he fights, and then maybe he comes home, but then the war itself continues for so long that his son then grows up, right? 10 years later, let's say he's 8, 10 years later, he joins the military upon graduating high school, and he is still fighting in that war. And that is what the Afghanistan war essentially was. It's a generational war at this point, that mathematically those types of things are possible. And for some reason, the American public was okay with this, right? Like, would we have been okay in World War II if we were like, hey, let's just fight the Nazis, forever? Because you know what's super fun? Not having, if you're Mr. Maxey would say, not having bananas. Right? That's great. I like not even being able to get bananas. All right? And, of course, now you might want to say, well, why would we be okay with that? Like, we're not even cool with, look at the protests under the current stay-at-home orders. look at the protests going on for that, and it's only been a month and a half, right? So why all of a sudden are we okay with generational war and the sacrifices that come with that? And I think my point to you would be, are we really sacrificing during the Iraq War and the Afghanistan War? Is your life really different? And I'm not talking about, do you have a father or a mother or a brother in the war who may have died from the war or been impacted with PTSD from the war. I mean, not with no family member in the conflict, right? Is your life different? Like, are you sacrificing like World War II? Could you get bananas during the Afghan War, the Iraq War? Yeah, you could. Could you during World War II? No. Things are rationed, right? And so once things are rationed, you start demanding government action pretty fast. And we're not even, I mean, think about the government demands that various political situations are being put upon governors and mayors and the president in that situation. Some of them are being created themselves, make no mistake. But you start getting limited and you start demanding answers, right? Well, we weren't being limited during this war on terror, right? If that makes sense. Okay. All right. To earlier generations, place names like Iraq and Afghanistan had been synonymous with European rashness, the sort of obscure and unwelcoming jurisdictions to which overly ambitious kings and slightly mad adventurers might repair to squabble. For the present generation, it has already become part of the natural order of things that GIs should be exerting themselves at great cost to pacify such far-off domains. For the average American tuning into the nightly news, reports of U.S. casualties incurred in distant lands now seem hardly more out of the ordinary than reports of partisan shenanigans on Capitol Hill or brush fires raging out of control in Southern California. How exactly did the end of the long peace so quickly yield the long war? Seeing themselves as a peaceful people, Americans remain wedded to the conviction that the conflicts in which they find themselves embroiled are not their own making. The global war on terror is no exception. Highlight this. Certain to our own benign intentions, we reflexively assign responsibility for war to others, typically malignant, Hitler-like figures, inexplicably bent on denying us the peace that is our fondest wish. Stop there. And you were supposed to highlight, just in case, certain of our own benign intentions, stop at fondest wish. And we've mentioned this before. When you want to make someone think that there is a bad guy, unquestionably, you compare him to who, Macy Bartley? Hitler, right? Hitler. You throw out Hitler and no one's going to be like, was he that bad? No, he was bad, right? Hitler was bad, okay? And so it kind of like quells a dissent there. And it's a classic American thing. We've talked about this before, that we don't like being the instigators of conflict. We like being the guys that end the conflict, right? We are pulled, dragging, and screaming out of our peaceful slumber of peace. We fight, 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 death, 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 victory, and then we go back to our peaceful slumber until we're dragged again once more. And that's what we kind of have always gone with the war on terror as well, in terms of how the perception of why we're fighting in these regions, right? And I don't know if I would necessarily say that we think that now, but at the time that these conflicts were arising, right? This book challenges that supposition. It argues that the actions of Saddam Hussein and Osama bin Laden, however malevolent, cannot explain why the United States today finds itself enmeshed in seemingly never-ending conflict. Although critics of the U.S. foreign policy, and especially of the Iraq War, have already advanced a variety of alternative explanations, variously fingering President Bush, members of his inner circle, jingoistic neoconservatives, greedy oil executives, or even the Israel lobby, it also finds those explanations inadequate. Certainly the president and his advisors, along with neocons, always looking for opportunities to flex American military muscle, bear considerable culpability for our current predicament. Highlight this. Yet to charge them with primary responsibility is to credit them with undeserved historical significance. It's the equivalent of blaming Herbert Hoover for the Great Depression or of attributing McCarthyism entirely to the antics of Senator Joseph McCarthy. The impulses that have landed us in a war of no exits and no deadlines come from within. Stop there. Now, one big thing I meant to mention at the when this book was published is that it's right at the peak of the Iraq War, about 2005, I believe. This book is published either 2003 or 2005, and it's right at the peak of the Iraq War, when it really looked like no one was in sight. And what he's essentially saying is we sit here and we blame President Bush for bamboozling us with the weapons of mass destruction that Iraq had and this idea that they're the ones to blame. But what he's going to say is, as a voting nation, as a democratic, as a republic, right, where we elect people to represent our interests, we kind of should be holding them to a standard where, rather than buying into everything that they're giving us, if we don't like what they're doing, we should be replacing them. And of course, as we're going to get to as we go down through this book, we don't do that. All right. So a couple of things I want to point out when he's talking about jingoism, right? It's that we've had that term before with imperialism. Jingoism is that adamant, almost like violent patriotism. And when he talks about neoconservatives, shortening it often to neocons, what he's talking about there is conservatives after Reagan. So you've got President Reagan, and you've got conservatives, and any conservative after him who base everything they do and want and believe after Reagan has been president of the United States. All right. Foreign policy has, for decades, provided an outward manifestation of American domestic ambitions, urges, and fears. In our own time, it has increasingly become an expression of domestic dysfunction, an attempt to manage or defer coming to terms with contradictions besetting the American way of life. Those contradictions have found their ultimate expression in the perpetual state of war afflicting the United States today. Gauging their implications requires that we acknowledge their source. They reflect the accumulated detritus of freedom, the byproducts of our frantic pursuit of life, liberty, and happiness. Freedom is the altar at which Americans worship, whatever their nominal religious persuasion. No one sings odes to liberty at the final end of life with greater fervor than Americans. The theologian Reinhold Niebuhr, he loves this guy. He's going to mention Niebuhr throughout the book. Loves this guy. Once observed. Yet, even as they celebrate freedom, Americans exempt the object of their veneration from critical examination. In our public discourse, freedom is not so much a word or even a value as an incantation. Its very mention enough to stifle doubt and terminate all debate. The limits of power will suggest that this heedless worship of freedom has been a mixed blessing. Highlight this. In our pursuit of freedom, we have accrued obligations and piled up debt that we are increasingly hard-pressed to meet. Stop there. Especially since the 60s, freedom itself has undercut the nation's ability to fulfill its commitments. We teeter on the edge of insolvency, desperately trying to balance accounts by relying on our presumably invincible armed forces. Yet, there too, having exaggerated our military might, we court bankruptcy. The United States today finds itself threatened by three interlocking crises. Highlight this. The first of these crises is economic and cultural, the second political, and the third military. All three share this characteristic. They are of our own making. Stop there. In assessing the predicament that results from these crises, the limits of power employs what might be called a Niebuhrian perspective. Writing decades ago, Reinhold Niebuhr anticipated that predicament with uncanny accuracy and astonishing prescience. As such, perhaps more than any other figure in our history, he may help us discern our way out. A pastor, teacher, activist, theologian, and prolific author, Niebuhr was a towering presence in American intellectual life from the 1930s to the 60s. Even today, he deserves recognition as the most clear-eyed of American prophets. Niebuhr speaks to us from the past, offering truths of enormous relevance to the present. As prophet, he warned that what we called our dreams of managing history, born of a peculiar combination of arrogance and narcissism, posed a potentially moral threat to the United States. Today, we ignore that warning at our peril. Niebuhr entertained a few illusions about the nature of man, the possibility of politics, or the pliability of history. Global economic crises, total war, genocide, totalitarianism, and nuclear arsenals capable of destroying civilization itself. He viewed all of these with an unblinking eye that allowed no room for hypocrisy, hokum, or self-deception. Realism and humility formed the core of his worldview, each infused with a deeply felt Christian sensibility. Realism in this sense implies an obligation to see the world as it actually is, not as we like it to be. Highlight this. The enemy of realism is hubris, which in the Niebuhr's day, in our own, finds expression in an outsized confidence in the efficacy of American power as an instrument to reshape the global order. And so what do we mean by that? We've talked about this before. Hubris being gross self-indulgence, arrogance, not self-indulgence. That's not what that means. Nope. Hubris means arrogance to the point of self-destructiveness, right? And what would be an example of American hubris in his mind, right? Again, not you have to agree with all this stuff. This is just in what he's kind of trying to relate. It's not, you don't have to agree with these things. You just have to be able to understand the argument, all right? And what that is he's saying we felt we were an untouchable power, and therefore we didn't really worry about defending our nation with our military so much as projecting our power in the world, and it left us open to 9/11, is essentially what he's getting at there, all right? Humility imposes an obligation of a different sort. It summons Americans to see themselves without blinders. The enemy of humility is sanctimony, which gives rise to the conviction that American values and beliefs are universal and that the nation itself serves providentially assigned purposes. Highlight this. This conviction finds expression in a determination to remake the world in what we see and what we imagine to be America's image. Stop there. In our own day, realism and humility have proven short supply. What Niebuhr wrote after World War II proved truer still in the immediate aftermath of the Cold War. Good fortune in a position of apparent preeminence placed the United States under the most grievous temptations to self-adulation. Americans have given themselves over to those temptations. Hubris and sanctimony have become the paramount expression of American statecraft. And thus ends part 1 of the introduction to Limits of Power.